The flight begins, and the whisper of suspicion. The morning air over the city hummed with the restless promise of travel and change, as the terminal lights glowed like a river of quiet, stars guiding strangers toward new days and unknown destinations. And among them walked a black man named David, moving with an easy, steady grace that suggested long miles behind him, and longer. Miles ahead, he carried a modest leather bag, worn by time in capable hands, and a folded jacket over one arm, his gaze calm and observant while announcements rolled overhead, like waves on steel and glass. He passed the coffee stand where steam curled upward like hope, and the security lane where trays rattled like nervous hearts, and he spoke kindly to the attendant, who scanned his boarding pass and smiled back, because courtesy can still light a dark hallway. The jet bridge exhaled a cool breath, and he stepped onto it, feeling the small vibration of engines, waiting in patience for the sky. And as he entered the cabin, he nodded to the first flight attendant, a woman with practiced warmth and a careful smile, the sort of smile that can hold a room together, even when the room tilts. And he found his seat by the window, and settled in with quiet economy, moving his bag beneath the seat, and resting his jacket across his knees, while he watched ground crew lights blink in the dawn like distant fires. Across a field across the aisle, a pair of men in tailored jackets eased into their row with the casual a certainty of people who expect the world to say yes to them. One scrolls through a phone with quick flicks and sharp inhales. The other checks a leather wallet, then tucks it deep into a carry-on, and they talk in low tones about meetings and margins, and the victory lap waiting at the end of a good quarter. Behind David, a college kid fumbles with a camera strap and a neck pillow, and apologizes to everyone for his elbows and hyper-energy, while a mother too rose up soothes a toddler with a soft song that rises like a bird in the thin air of the cabin. The overhead bins thump and click, the doors sigh shut, and stillness settles for a heartbeat that feels like a held breath before takeoff. David turns to the window and watches frost crystals feather across the glass, delicate as lace, and he thinks of the first flights he took years ago, when nerves sat heavy on his ribs, and he had to pretend calm until calm became real. And he smiles inwardly, because practice makes bravery look natural. He pulls out a thin paperback and slides a pen between the pages, and then closes it again, because the cabin tells its own story and he wants to hear it. The attendants begin their checks, and a soft chorus of seatbelts clicks into place like rain. On a metal roof, one of the suited men leans into the aisle and flags. A flight attendant with a raised hand and an eager grin, asking for water and a little extra legroom. If possible, the attendant promises to see what can be done, and the man winks at his friend as if the world is clay, waiting for his thumbprint. At first, the whispers are ordinary soft notes. In a crowded room, a sigh about delays, a question about overhead space, a murmur about weather rolling in from the west. But then a different current threads through the cabin, thin as fishing line, almost invisible, until it tugs your attention. Someone up front mentions something about a lost watch, and someone else mentions a bag that looked unzipped, and a third voice says, "I thought he tucked it away." And the current slides backward through the rows, shaping itself into suspicion, and the suspicion looks for an easy shape to wear, for an easy place to land, where the noise will be less messy, and the blame will feel simple. The suited man across the aisle touches his carry-on with a quick pat, and then touches it again harder, and then unzips it, and breathes sharply, and his friend leans closer, and his eyebrows shoot up like shutters in a storm. David feels the shift, the way a sailor feels a change in wind. There is a tone people share when doubt enters a room. Even if the words stay polite, the eyes give it away, the way they flicker and try to look casual and fail. He keeps his breathing slow and his shoulders easy, because he understands how fast a narrative can run if no one puts a hand on the reins. He remembers boardrooms where assumptions walked in first, wearing sharp suits and perfect smiles, and he remembers community centers where people learned how to listen before they spoke. And he carries both memories, the hard and the hopeful, like two stones in his pocket that keep him balanced and awake. The plane begins to push back, and the cabin lights dim, and a hush gathers like velvet while safety instructions play with clear, measured rhythm. The attendant near David demonstrates the vest and the mask, and every so often her eyes flick to the suited men, whose voices have gone lower and quicker, as if speed will turn doubt into certainty. The college kid behind David notices the tension and pops his headphones off his ears halfway, unsure whether to pretend nothing is happening or lean into the unfolding drama. The mother up front holds her toddler closer and hums a little louder, not A warning, just a bubble of calm to shelter a small heart until the world remembers. Kindness. The wheels nudge forward, the muscles of the plane waking from sleep, and the runway stripes glide beneath like bars on a staff of music. But the suited man rises before the attendants can take their seats. He raises a hand again and insists on speaking to someone in authority. His voice is crisp and cool, but tight around the edges, like a rope pulled too hard. He says something about a missing wallet, whispers the word theft with the caution of people who like to stay respectable, even when their words are knives, and the attendant nods and asks him to sit for safety and promises to look, and he sits, but not fully. His posture, a hover of accusation. His gaze sweeping the rows, landing, then lifting like a hawk testing thermals. David keeps his eyes on the window for a beat longer, grounding himself in the honest language of motion and light, because clouds do not care for gossip, they only move, and reveal and conceal and move again. He turns back slowly, with the dignity of someone who refuses to be hurried into another person's story, and the college kid behind him mutters that this feels weird and too quiet, while another passenger whispers that security should have double-checked at the gate, and a man in a baseball cap says loudly that people never learn, and all of it stacks up like boxes in a narrow hallway until no one can pass without bumping an edge. The attendant returns to the suited men and kneels to speak softly and professionally, her hands steady as stones in a river. She asks for details. Where was the wallet? When was it last seen? Did anyone else handle the bag? The men answer with the impatience of customers. Used to instant solutions, they talk over each other and point to the overhead bins and flick their eyes left across the aisle toward David without quite landing, because landing would be an accusation, and an accusation requires courage that they do not have yet. The attendant thanks them and stands and begins a brief check of nearby bins and seat pockets, apologizing as she goes, keeping her tone gentle like a teacher guiding a class through a surprise drill. People smile tightly and move their knees aside and pretend not to stare at David. While very much staring at David, he sits almost perfectly still, but not rigid, still like a tree that knows how to bend in wind. His hands rest on his jacket, and he lets a slow breath move in, out with the patience of a violinist, tuning a single string to perfect pitch. He thinks about names and labels, and how quickly they can shrink a life to a headline, and he chooses instead to expand his presence, to fill his seat with calm, to occupy his own space without apology, to become undeniable. Without being loud, he glances at the attendant when she reaches his row and says with warmth, "If there is any way I can help, please let me know." And the offer floats there like a clean light in a dim hall, and she gives a small grateful nod, as if that light makes it easier to seethe. Engines build their layered hum. The plane pauses at the mouth of the runway like a runner poised in the blocks, and the captain speaks with a steady cadence that tells everyone they are safe and seen. But beneath the reassurance, the cabin's pulse has quickened. People feel the gravity of a story beginning to write itself, and everyone wonders who will hold the pen. The suited men whisper again. One of them finally looks full at David, and then quickly away, as if the look itself were too heavy to carry a long second. The college kid behind David leans forward and whispers that he saw the man tuck his wallet away earlier, but he is not sure, and his voice trembles with the weight of maybe and the fear of being wrong. In that stretched quiet where the wheels are about to roll faster and the city is a heartbeat behind them, a final whisper moves along the aisle like smoke. Someone near the front says they saw a passenger reach for a bag that was not theirs, and the rumor curls and twists and grows teeth, and before anyone can pin it down, it has already learned a name in the minds of those who need a simple shape for a complicated feeling. And every eye that was hovering finally lands on David, waiting to see if he will bow to their script or write his own, and the moment holds its breath as the engines surge and the runway streaks by, and the cabin rises into the sky, carrying a question that will demand an answer very soon. The missing wallet and the pointing fingers. The plane rose into the morning sky with the smooth lift of wings that had carried countless journeys before, yet inside the cabin no one felt that gentle grace for long, because the tension borne on the ground had followed them upward like an uninvited shadow. The engines hummed their steady song, but under it ran the restless beat of suspicion, and every heart leaned into that rhythm, waiting for the next note. The suited man across the aisle shifted in his seat, his jaw tight, his eyes darting from his carry-on bag to the aisle, to the overhead compartment, as if somewhere between those spaces his missing wallet might reveal itself. His fingers tapped against his leg faster than the beat of the engines, while his friend whispered sharp words meant for him alone but loud enough for Rose nearby to taste the flavor of blame. The flight attendant knelt again by their row, her professionalism like armor polished through years of service, her voice soft but carrying as she asked, "When did you last have it? Can you recall exactly where it was when you saw it last?" The suited man shook his head with exasperation and declared that it was in the side pocket when he boarded. He had checked it twice, once at security and once again before stowing. His bag, he said. No one else had touched it. No one could have unless someone reached across while he was distracted, and his hand flicked ever so slightly toward. David, without staying there long enough to be called an accusation from Singers, leaned closer, hungry for details, as if mystery were a meal they had been craving. The college kid behind David craned his neck, straining to see the bag, while the mother with the toddler tightened her arms around her child, instinctively protecting innocence from the sharpness of adult fear. A man in the back row muttered that people should watch their belongings better, while another said in a low tone that things like this happen all the time, and usually it is the person who looks too calm who has something to hide. The whisper moved like a ripple through water, distorting every reflection. David sat quietly, his eyes on the paperback still closed on his lap, his fingers resting on the pen inside it. He heard every word, though no one spoke his name directly. He could feel the story weaving its net around him, strand by strand, subtle looks that lingered to long murmurs that always ended when his eyes lifted to meet them. Suspicion does not need proof, it only needs an audience willing to believe, and in that cabin every soul was part of the theater. The plane tilted slightly, banking through clouds, while the captain's calm voice announced their altitude, yet the announcement felt thin compared to the growing storm within the cabin. The suited man raised his hand and insisted more firmly now that something must be done, that he wanted the head attendant immediately, that he could not sit quietly while his wallet vanished into thin air. The lead attendant, a tall man with years of lines carved into his patient face, approached. With practiced calm he bent low, listened, nodded, then assured the passengers the procedure would be followed. The plane would not land early, but they would search as much as possible during flight. He asked everyone to check around their seats, their bags, the overhead bins, to be sure nothing was misplaced. The request traveled down the aisle like an order, and soon passengers were unzipping backpacks, sliding hands into seat pockets, peering under blankets and jackets. The college kid checked his camera bag twice, nearly spilling a lens. The mother opened her diaper bag and shook her head, quickly, eager to show she carried nothing but bottles and blankets. The suited men made a show of rifling through their carry-on, pulling out folders and chargers and a bundle of papers, but no wallet. Their faces darkened with each empty reach. Then came the moment that pressed harder than the rest. The lead attendant paused by David's row, his voice gentle but heavy as he said, "Sir, if you would not mind, could you please check under your seat and in your bag, just as the others have?" David met his gaze, his expression calm with a trace of sadness, as though he had been down this road too many times before. He nodded slowly, placed the jacket aside, pulled his bag from beneath the seat, and unzipped it with careful movements. The college kid leaned forward, the suited men leaned sideways, the eyes of half the cabin leaned into that small space where truth or accusation might suddenly spring forth. Inside the bag lay nothing more than a folded shirt, a book, another pen, a small case for glasses, and a packet of documents, neatly arranged. The attendant looked briefly, then nodded, thanking him. David lifted the bag to show the floor beneath, empty but for the dark carpet pressed down by his shoes. He placed it back quietly, every movement steady, like the beating of a drum that refuses to change its rhythm even when surrounded by chaos. Yet the eyes still clung to him, because suspicion, once born, does not die from lack of evidence, it grows fat on silencer. Suited man whispered harshly to his friend, loud enough now for others to hear, "This is ridiculous. It had to be taken while aboarded. No one else sat close except him." And again his hand flicked toward David. The friend nodded quickly, his face flushed, his eyes bright with indignation, and the murmur spread again, people repeating his words like seeds carried on the wind. Someone said maybe security missed something. Someone else said they should call authorities as soon as they land. Another muttered that you can never really know what a person is capable of. The college kid finally spoke out, his voice thin but brave. He said, "I think I saw you put the wallet in your bag earlier. I think I did, when you first sat down." But his words trembled with uncertainty, and the suited men snapped their heads around to stare at him. One said sharply, "Are you sure?" And the boy stammered, "Well, maybe I am. Not sure, but I thought I saw it." The man scoffed and turned back, muttering that children should stay out of matters they do not understand. David closed his eyes for a brief moment, drawing in the sound of engines steady beneath the turbulence of human hearts. He opened them again and looked across the aisle, his gaze resting on the suited man, without anger, without fear, just a level gaze that asked silently, "Is this the story you want to write about yourself? Is this the truth you want to believe?" The man shifted uncomfortably under that gaze, but pride held his spine stiff. His friend leaned closer, whispering words that only hardened his stance. The lead attendant, sensing the storm brewing, raised his voice gently, yet firmly, asking everyone to calm themselves, assuring that everything would be investigated upon arrival. He reminded them that baseless accusations harm everyone, that until evidence appeared, no one should be judged. His words hung in the air like a fragile bridge over a rushing river, yet beneath that bridge the current of whispers still surged. The toddler up front began to cry, sensing the unrest. The mother rocked her child, singing softly again, but the melody was swallowed by the rising tide of voices. Passengers whispering, passengers glaring, passengers shifting in their seats with restless energy, as though the cabin itself had shrunk and could no longer contain their mistrust. David leaned back into his seat, his hands folded over the jacket across his knees, his posture neither defensive nor submissive, but grounded like a pillar in the storm. He thought of moments in his past when people had doubted him, not for his actions but for his presence, and he remembered the lessons he had carried from those days, that dignity is not what others grant you, but what you hold for yourself. He let that memory wrap around him like armor and remained silent for now, letting the story unravel further, knowing the time would come when silence would no longer be enough. The plane cut through a bank of clouds, the sunlight breaking over the wings like a blade of gold, and inside the cabin, eyes still watched him as if the light itself carried judgment. The suited man tapped his empty pocket again, his lips pressed tight, and the whispers circled tighter around David like wolves in the brush, not yet striking but hungry for the scent of blame. The missing wallet had become more than leather and paper. It had become a spark setting fire to prejudice and fear, and every flicker of that fire leaned toward the man who sat calm by the window, while the rest of the cabin waited breathless to see whether the flame would consume him or reveal something they had never expected to see. Confrontation in the aisle. The plane soared steady above the clouds, yet inside the cabin the calm of the sky did not reach the hearts of the passengers. The whispers had become stronger threads, weaving suspicion into a net that wrapped tighter around David with each passing minute. The suited man, no longer content with murmurs, rose half from his seat, his body leaning into the aisle as if authority lived in his posture. His voice sharp enough to slice through the hum of the engines, he called for the lead attendant again, demanding action, demanding justice, demanding that someone be held responsible before the plane touched down, and his words carried a tremor of anger that pulled every head toward him. The attendant approached, his face calm but his eyes heavy with the weight of too many conflicts smothered by patience. He asked the man to return to his seat until turbulence cleared, but the man shook his head, refusing, his voice rising as he pointed toward David across the aisle and declared that it was impossible for the wallet to vanish without someone taking it, and that the only person close enough had been him. The words hung there like a blade in the narrow aisle, sharp and heavy, every passenger feeling the sting, whether they agreed or not. David sat still, his hands folded, his gaze steady. He did not rise to meet the storm. He let it rage around him while he anchored himself in silence. Yet silence in such moments is not absence, it is presence, shaped by dignity, and that presence made the suited man grow louder as though he could not stand the refusal to break. He pointed again, his finger trembling with a mixture of certainty and fear. He said, "Look at him." To calm. Too quiet, no one else could have done it, and the friend beside him nodded, adding fuel, whispering loudly enough for all to hear that the evidence was obvious. Passengers shifted in their seats, some murmuring agreement, others shaking their heads, but none willing to speak above the tide. The college kid behind David bit his lip, his eyes wide, torn between truth and fear. The mother with the toddler hushed her child again, her eyes flashing disapproval at the suited man, but her voice remained silent, for she knew voices can be dangerous in a crowd. The man in the baseball cap leaned forward and muttered that the attendants should check him thoroughly, because only a guilty man would sit so calm. The lead attendant raised his hand for silence, reminding everyone that accusations without proof harm more than they heal. yet his voice, though steady, carried less weight than the roar of suspicion once born. Suspicion grows, legs and runs faster than reason. The suited man ignored him and stood, fully now his presence looming in the narrow aisle, as he demanded that David stand and show himself, that he open his jacket and his pockets, that he clear the doubt once and for all. Eyes turned to David, waiting to see if he would resist or comply, waiting for the story to twist into spectacle. David lifted his gaze, slowly meeting the suited man's eyes. With the calm of a mountain facing storm, he did not rise quickly, but with measured grace, unfolding from his seat, as though every movement belonged to him, not to the demands of others. His height was unassuming, yet his presence filled the space. He placed his jacket gently on the seat, his bag already searched lying at his feet. His voice low yet clear, he said, "If you wish me to stand, I will stand. If you wish to search me, I have nothing to hide. But know this: suspicion is not truth, and accusation is not justice." The cabin grew still at his words, the hum of engines the only sound for a long breath. Then the suited man sneered and motioned for him to turn his pockets out. David obeyed with slow, deliberate movements, reaching into each pocket and revealing only a folded ticket stub, a pen, and a small notebook. Nothing more. He laid them on the seat beside his jacket, the attendant watching closely, nodding that the search revealed nothing yet. The suited man was not satisfied. He muttered that it could still be hidden somewhere. On him the friend chimed in, saying that people know how to conceal things, while the murmur picked up again, passengers whispering theories, as if the plane had become a courtroom suspended in air. David straightened his shoulders, his calm no longer silence, but quiet strength. He stepped into the aisle fully now, his presence undeniable. He looked around at the faces staring at him, some with doubt, some with shame, some with curiosity. He spoke not loud, but firm enough to reach every row. He said, "You look at me and see a story you want to believe, a story that makes fear easy and blame simple, but I will not be the shape for your prejudice. I have lived too many years carrying dignity heavier than suspicion, and I will carry it." Still his words struck different hearts in different ways. Some passengers lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others hardened, further unwilling to let go of their suspicion. The suited man flushed red, his pride wounded by the refusal to break. He stepped closer, his finger stabbing the air inches from David's chest, saying calm words mean nothing. "Where is my wallet?" It did not vanish into the air. "It must be here, and I know you have it." Attendant stepped between them at once, his arms raised, his tone commanding now, not the gentle patience from before, but authority sharpened by necessity. He ordered the suited man back to his seat. He told him firmly that no more accusations would be allowed until the authorities on the ground could investigate. The man hesitated, his pride battling the command, but the eyes of the cabin and the weight of the attendant's authority pressed him back into his seat. Muttering curses under his breath, his friend patting his shoulder in false comfort, Davy remained standing in the aisle, his posture calm, his breathing even though inside the sting of injustice coiled tight. He looked once more around the cabin and then slowly returned to his seat, gathering his belongings with care, as though to show the world that calm cannot be stolen. Suspicion may try to chain dignity, but dignity when held firm becomes unbreakable. He placed his jacket across his knees, again his pen and notebook atop it, then leaned back to the window, his gaze on the endless stretch of clouds outside. Yet the story was not over, because the whispers did not die, they only shifted. They wondered if the wallet would appear somewhere hidden, if perhaps it had been tossed into another bag, or slipped into a pocket unnoticed, and with each whisper the eyes returned to David like moths to a flame that refused to burn away. The suited man sat stiff, his arms crossed, his jaw tight, his mind replaying the loss over and over, feeding his certainty that guilt sat across the aisle. The cabin hung heavy in that uneasy balance, the attendants working quietly to maintain order, the passengers divided between belief and doubt, the college kid restless in his seat wanting to speak again but fear pressing his tongue still, the mother with the toddler humming softly once more, her melody weaving through the tension like a fragile thread of peace, the baseball cap man still muttering that the truth would come out, and when it did, people would see. Confrontation had not ended the storm, it had only sharpened it. The aisle had become a stage, the passengers an audience, the accused a man who carried silence like a shield, the accuser a man who carried pride like a weapon, and above them the sky stretched vast and unjudging, holding secrets that soon would demand to be revealed. The evidence and the rising storm, the sky outside remained calm, the sunlight streaming through the oval windows in golden streaks that fell across the cabin but inside the plane. The air felt thick like a storm pressed down upon every heart, and every whisper the confrontation in the aisle had not ended suspicion, it had only deepened the divide. Some passengers leaned toward certainty that David must have done it, while others shifted, uncomfortably wishing they could speak, but feeling their voices would be drowned in the tide of anger and fear. The suited man sat stiff in his seat, his arms crossed, his eyes burning with restless frustration. His friend, leaning close, whispering words that dripped with certainty, feeding the fire that already threatened to consume the the lead attendant had ordered silence, but silence cannot be commanded when fear has already taken root. The passengers obeyed outwardly, their mouths closed, their hands folded, but their eyes, their glances, their restless movements betrayed the storm within. The cabin became a field of unspoken judgments. Every small motion, every sigh, every cough became another note in the song of Onista. Suited man could not keep still, his hands moved constantly, searching his carry-on bag, pulling out papers and chargers and books, rifling through them again and again, as if repetition would force the wallet to appear. He shook each item with frustration, and then shoved it back, and with every shake his anger grew like a drumbeat, his mutters louder, his glances sharper, until once again his gaze landed on David, and refused to let go. The lead attendant returned, this time with another crew member, a woman with a firm jaw and eyes that could slice through the noise. She crouched by the suited man's seat, asking again for the details. When was the last moment you touched the wallet? Was it on the ground or already in the air? The man insisted loudly that he had checked it after security, and again before stowing it in the overhead compartment, and then again when he reached for his phone, but now it was gone. His words carried the weight of performance, each sentence delivered for the ears of everyone around him, so that even those who had not cared before now found themselves caught in the web. The attendant asked him calmly if he could have misplaced it elsewhere, in his jacket or another bag. His face flushed red, as though insulted by the suggestion. He patted his jacket, roughly emptying each pocket one by one, and then threw the jacket back with a growl, saying no, it was in the bag, it was right there, and someone must have taken it. His eyes shifted again toward David and lingered longer, this time the accusation almost spoken aloud. The passengers closest to them felt the ripple of tension. The college kid leaned back into his seat, chewing his lip until it almost bled, his eyes wide, as though trapped in a play. He could not escape the mother with the toddler pressed her child against her shoulder, rocking gently, but her gaze fixed on the scene, sharp and knowing. Her song had fallen silent, because even music could not drown the weight of what was rising. The baseball cap man spoke louder now, saying that the airline should restrain the suspect until the police could board at landing. His words slicing into the cabin like a knife. Passengers around him nodded, some quickly, some hesitantly, and the murmur rose again. The female attendant raised her hand firmly, calling for calm, but just as she did, something shifted. The suited man pulled his bag closer, and in his frantic rummaging produced a folded napkin, and within it a crumpled boarding stub, not his, but belonging to another passenger. His eyes widened, and he held it up, shouting, "CC, someone has tampered with my bag, this is not mine," and his voice rang through the cabin like thunder. The passengers gasped, leaning forward, eyes snapping to David as though the napkin itself had pointed fingers. David remained still, his eyes falling to the stub, then lifting calmly to the attendant, his face unshaken, though he knew what it meant in the eyes of those eager to believe. The suited man thrust the stub toward the attendants, repeating that it was proof someone had touched his belongings. Someone had reached inside and left behind something that was not his. He demanded again that David be searched more thoroughly, that the truth be dragged into light. Attendants exchanged uneasy glances. The female attendant inspected the stub, then turned to David, her voice careful, respectful, but carrying the weight of procedure. "Sir," she said, "passengers are growing restless, and we have to maintain order. Would you allow us to inspect your belongings again?" David gave a small nod, his voice even. "I have nothing to hide." He placed his jacket aside, once more pulled his bag into his lap, and opened it wide, his movements slow, deliberate. He removed each item, the folded shirt, the glasses case, the documents, the book, the pen. He placed them neatly on the seat beside him, then turned the bag inside out, showing its seams, its corners, nothing hidden. The attendants leaned close, their hands brushing through the fabric, their eyes scanning every pocket, but they found nothing. The bag was clean, David folded it back, calmly returned each item to its place, and looked at the attendants. His voice steady. "Do you see now? Suspicion cannot create truth." The female attendant gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, but before she could speak, the suited man barked that it proved nothing, that clever hands can hide things well, that he would not be satisfied until the police themselves had searched him. The cabin erupted with voices, some passengers agreeing, some shaking their heads, some pleading for quiet. The college kid finally leaned forward, his voice breaking as he spoke loudly enough for many to hear. "I saw him put the wallet in his bag when he boarded. I saw it with my own eyes. I am not making it up." The words trembled, but they rang with a desperate kind of truth. The suited man snapped around, his face twisted with fury, asking, "Are you accusing me of lying?" The boy's face paled, but he did not retract his words. He repeated, softer but clear, "I think you had it all along." Gasps spread through the roseheads, turned whispers shot like arrows. The mother with the toddler whispered to the woman beside her that the boy was brave. The baseball cap man shouted that the kid was confused, that children imagined things. The cabin had become a cauldron boiling with voices, each louder, each hotter. The attendants raised their hands, but the noise swelled beyond their control. David remained calm, his eyes shifting not to the suited man but across the cabin, taking in the faces, the doubts, the fear, the shame. He saw the truth, struggling like a bird caught in a cage, beating its wings against bars built of pride and prejudice. He leaned back, his breath slow, his silence a statement more powerful than any denial, because the storm fed itself on anger, but it could not consume the dignity he held. The suited man waved the boarding stub again, demanding that it be treated as evidence, his friend echoing his anger, calling for restraint, calling for justice, as though justice were a chain to be locked on the wrists of an innocent man. The attendants stood firm between them, their eyes sharp, their voices raised, now telling everyone to sit, too calm to wait until landing when security could sort the truth. Yet even as they spoke, the storm did not fade, it swirled heavier, the eyes of the passengers still returning again and again to David, though nothing had been found, though every search had shown him clear. A plane cut through another stretch of cloud turbulence, rocking the cabin trays, rattling overhead bins, shuddering passengers gripping armrests tightly, but even the roll of the sky could not shake the human storm below. The suspicion had grown roots too deep, the whispers too strong, the suited man's anger to Ludan, that chaos. David sat by the window, his eyes on the endless horizon where the clouds parted to reveal a river of sunlight stretching forever. He let the light steady him because he knew the storm was reaching its peak, and with every storm there comes a moment when truth either breaks free or is buried, and he prepared himself because he felt in his bones that the moment of revelation was near, and when it came it would silence the cabin in a way no command ever could. The stunning revelation, the air inside the cabin felt heavier than the altitude should allow, every breath thick with tension, every glance sharp with judgment. The storm of voices had grown wild, and though the attendants stood like walls against the tide, even their voices could not bring back order. The suited man's anger had reached its highest pitch, his words cutting across the hum of engines as he insisted that guilt sat in the window seat across from him, his finger nearly trembling with the weight of his conviction. Passengers leaned forward, craning to see if something would break, if the quiet man by the window would finally snap or confess or collapse under the crushing eyes. But David did none of these things. He rose slowly, not because of their demands, but because the moment had come to end the storm. His movements calm, deliberate, a steady rhythm that drew silence around him, row by row like water calming under moonlight. He placed his jacket neatly on the seat, placed his notebook on top, and then stepped into the aisle with a grace that made the narrow space feel like a stage. He stood straight, his eyes moving across the passengers, each face captured for a heartbeat in his gaze, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, but carried to every corner of the cabin. "You have judged me by silence and calm," he began, his words unhurried, measured, as though carved from stone. "You have painted me guilty without proof, because suspicion is easier than truth. You searched my bag, you searched my seat, you searched my pockets and found nothing, yet still, your fear needs a face, and your pride needs a villain, and so you chose me." The cabin held its breath. Even the suited man faltered for a second, caught by the weight of those words. But pride, once fed, is hard to starve, and he scoffed loudly, asking then, "Who are you? What gives you the right to act so calm when a man's wallet is missing?" David let the words settle, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled free a small leather case smooth polished its surface, catching the overhead light. He opened it slowly and held it up for all to see. Inside lay an identification card gleaming with the seal of the company, embossed in silver letters, bold and clear, and beneath them the title, Chief Executive Officer, and the name David Carter. The silence that followed struck harder than thunder. The suited man's eyes widened, his face drained of color. His friend froze mid-breath. Passengers shifted in their seats, their mouths opening, but no words escaping. David's gaze rested on the suited man, his voice calm but firm. I am the new chief executive of the very company you serve, the company whose emblem is stitched on your tie and engraved on your laptop. I boarded this flight not to be paraded as a suspect, but to see for myself the way my people treat strangers, the way they treat customers. And today I have seen truth more raw than any report could show. Gasps rippled through the rows. Disbelief colliding with shame. The mother with the toddler whispered softly, "Oh my God," while rocking her child. The college kid's jaw dropped, his eyes wide with awe. The baseball cap man, who had been loud in his suspicion, sank back into his seat, his face red. The attendants stared for a moment, stunned, before recovering their poise, their eyes now carrying something new, respect mixed with relief. Suited man sputtered, his voice broken by the crack in his pride. This is not possible. This is some trick. I never knew about a change in leadership." David held the case closer so the name and seal could not be denied, his voice cutting through the man's stumbling words. "It was announced quietly to the board last week, not yet made public, because I wanted to observe before the storm of headlines. I chose to travel without escort, without announcement, because I wanted honesty, and now I have." A heavy silence spread through the cabin, pressing into every row. Every passenger felt the weight of revelation, the realization that the man they had judged, the man they had whispered against, the man accused of theft, was the very leader who now held power over their company and their future. The suited man's face burned with humiliation, sweat beading at his temple, his lips quivering as if words might save him, but none came. He sank back into his seat, his eyes falling to his lap, unable to meet the gaze of the man he had accused. David turned slowly, his voice steady, resonant, each word a note in the symphony of truth. "You accused me because of what you saw on the surface, because calm looked suspicious, because silence looked guilty, because difference made you uneasy. You judged before you knew, and in doing so you revealed more about yourself than you did about me." Passengers shifted in shame, heads lowered, eyes dropped to the floor. Some whispered apologies, though no words could undo what had been done. The college kid leaned forward, whispering to the passenger beside him, "I knew he was different. I knew he was more than they thought." The mother hugged her toddler tighter, her eyes glistening as if she wanted to speak, but chose instead to let her silence become respect. The attendants stood straighter, their voices firm now, declaring that order must be kept for the remainder of the flight. But beneath their calm tones, their faces carried admiration for the man who had held dignity like a shield against the storm. David did not shout, he did not gloat. His victory was not in crushing his accuser, but in holding his dignity intact until truth revealed itself. His power came not from the title in his hand, but from the grace with which he carried it. He placed the case back into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate, final, as though closing a chapter. He returned to his seat, his calm even deeper now, his presence commanding, not through force but through respect earned in silence and revealed in truth. Suited man sat frozen, his pride shattered, his whispers silenced. His friend, pale and quiet, beside him, the passengers who had doubted now looked at David with new eyes, eyes heavy with guilt and awe, eyes that wished they could erase their earlier thoughts but could not. The truth had stunned them all, left them speechless, and left the storm that had raged so fiercely. Suddenly, without breath, the engines hummed steady, carrying the plane forward. The sky outside, endless and open, the revelation had broken the storm and left behind stillness heavy but healing. The passengers sat in that silence, each of them knowing they had witnessed more than a missing wallet. They had witnessed the unveiling of truth and the undeniable power of dignity held against suspicion. The cabin was changed, and though no one spoke, the lesson lingered in every heart. That truth always arrives, though sometimes later than we wish, and when it comes, it does not whisper, it stuns. Respect earned, and the lesson learned. The cabin remained wrapped in silence long after David had returned to his seat. It was not the silence of suspicion now, it was the silence of shame and reflection, a silence that weighed heavy on those who had whispered and judged, a silence that pressed against the suited man like chains made not of steel but of his own pride. He sat with his head bowed, his hands clenched on his knees. His earlier bravado shattered into fragments that cut him from within. His friend who had stood with him sank low as well, his lips sealed, his shoulders slumped, for he too felt the sting of what had been revealed. The passengers who had once leaned into the whispers now leaned back, their eyes cast down, ashamed to meet the gaze of the man they had wronged. The mother with the toddler hummed softly again, but this time her voice trembled as if carrying both sorrow and relief. The college kid sat upright, his eyes shining not with fear now but with admiration, his heart pounding with the realization that he had been right to speak even when his voice had trembled. Their attendants moved quietly through the aisle, their professionalism intact, but their glances toward David were different now, carrying respect, gratitude, and an unspoken apology. They understood that they had stood at the center of a storm, not of their own making but one that revealed how fragile dignity can appear and how strong it must be to endure. The baseball-capped man who had spoken so harshly earlier kept shifting in his seat, unable to find comfort, now muttering to himself, but softer now, as if he hoped no one would hear. The suited man at last lifted his head, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He tried to form words but none would come. His throat closed under the weight of his humiliation. His gaze flicked to David for a second, then fell again, unable to endure the calm dignity that had undone his fury. The boarding stub still rested on his tray table, the so-called evidence that had been nothing more than coincidence, or perhaps even the careless slip of his own hands. It sat there mocking him with its emptiness. David remained calm, his gaze fixed on the horizon outside the window. The sunlight stretched endless, the clouds parted like curtains revealing a stage of light. He did not look at the suited man, he did not gloat, he did not strike back. His silence was more powerful than any words could be. His silence told the story of a man who needed no vindication from others because truth had already spoken on his behalf. He carried himself not as a man who had won, but as a man who had endured. The hours of the flight stretched on, but the cabin no longer buzzed with suspicion. It sat instead in quiet thoughtfulness, passengers thinking of their own judgments in life, their own hasty words, their own easy suspicions, and in that thought each of them learned something, though none spoke it aloud. They all knew it as surely as they knew the sound of the engines outside. When at last the plane began its descent, the captain's voice filled the cabin, calm, steady, reassuring. The city below rose to meet them, the lights twinkling like promises. The attendants prepared the cabin, but their eyes often drifted to David, as if to remind themselves that respect is not a courtesy, it is a duty. Passengers tightened seatbelts, trays locked, bags secured, but no one forgot the weight of what had transpired in the sky. As the wheels touched down with a soft thud, the suited man pressed back into his seat, his chest heavy, his mind spiraling. He knew the moment the doors opened, his life within the company he served would never be the same. His pride had built him high, but his actions had torn him down before the very man who now stood at the helm. He sat with sweat on his brow, knowing he had not only lost his wallet, but something far greater, his dignity. The plane rolled to a stop, the doors opened, the attendants released the rows in order, and passengers filed out into the jet bridge one by one. But as they passed David, many paused, their eyes meeting his, some with shame, some with gratitude, some with quiet awe. The college kid stopped, whispered softly, "Thank you for showing them the truth," and hurried on, cheeks red with both pride and nerves. The mother with the toddler paused and said gently, "Your strength will teach my child something I could never explain." Then she moved on, her lullaby echoing faintly behind her. The suited man rose slowly, his movements heavy. He turned to David, his lips trembling as if to speak, but no words came. Instead he bowed his head, a small gesture, heavy with regret, then hurried past his friend. Close behind, unable to face the weight of what lingered in the cabin, David gathered his jacket and his bag, rose with steady grace and stepped into the aisle. The attendants straightened as he passed each one, offering a silent nod of respect. He returned each with a quiet nod of his own, then walked down the jet bridge into the waiting world. On the ground, security was present, ready to investigate the claim of theft. But the suited man stopped them, shaking his head, muttering that it was nothing, that it was a mistake, his voice broken, his pride gone. And with that, the final storm faded away. David walked on through the terminal, his step steady, his heart calm. He knew he had faced more than an accusation, he had faced the mirror of human prejudice. The shadow of suspicion cast by fear and pride, he had faced it and endured, not with anger, not with fury, but with dignity and truth, and because of that the lesson would last longer than the flight. It would last in the hearts of every witness, for respect cannot be demanded, it must be earned, and once earned it cannot be taken away. The passengers had seen it. The attendants had felt it. The accuser had learned it. The truth had spoken not through loud voices, but through calm strength, and as David stepped into the light of the terminal, he knew that sometimes the most powerful revelations come not from grand speeches or battles, but from the quiet, unshaken dignity of a man who refuses to bow to false judgment. The story of that flight would travel far, whispered in offices, told at dinner tables, repeated in quiet moments, as a reminder of what happens when suspicion rises and truth is tested, and those who were there would never forget the day they accused a man, only to discover he was the very leader they were sworn to servant. In that memory they would find the lesson that dignity held against suspicion is stronger than any false accusation. The end.